The first case on our list is the mysterious deaths of Annette Schnee and Bobby Joe Oberholzer. In 1982, in Breckenridge, Colorado, the bodies of two women were discovered. They were found miles apart, 6 months between each discovery. But police believe they were murdered on the same night by the same person. The only link between them? A pair of orange socks. It all started on January 6, 1982. Bobby Joe Oberholzer, 29 years old, left her home at 7:15 a.m. Like usual, she hitchhiked to work. Bobby lived with her husband, Jeff, in Alma, which was about 14 miles from where her body was later found. Jeff ran an appliance repair business, while Bobby worked as a receptionist. They had been married for 4.5 years. That evening, Bobby called Jeff at 6:20 p.m. to let him know she was having drinks with friends after work. He asked if she needed a ride, but she told him she'd find one herself. Jeff stayed home, made dinner, and waited for her to come back. But after a while, he dozed off. When he woke up around midnight, Bobby still hadn't come home. Worried, Jeff drove to Breckenridge to look for her. Her friends told him that she had left the bar around 7:30 p.m. They thought she had already caught a ride. When Jeff reported Bobby missing to the police, they said it was too soon to file a report. So, Jeff drove back home and waited. The next morning, a farmer who lived 30 miles outside of Breckenridge found Bobby's driver's license on his property. Jeff, along with two friends, set out to search for her. They made a grim discovery, something blue lying in a snow-covered field. It was Bobby's backpack, along with one of her gloves, stained with blood and some bloody tissues. A search party was quickly organized. Just 2 hours later, they found Bobby's body more than 15 miles from where her backpack had been. She had been shot twice. Her house keys were found at the scene. Police noted 3 strange details. The only footprints were Bobby's. A plastic cord was tied around one of her wrists, and there was a single orange sock lying nearby. On the same day that Bobby's body was found, 21-year-old Annette Schnee was reported missing. Annette worked as a cocktail waitress in Frisco, Colorado, and like Bobby, she often hitchhiked to and from work. The similarities between the two cases made the police connect them right away. When investigators questioned Jeff about Annette, he initially said he didn't know her, but later, after seeing her photo on the news, he remembered meeting her once. Jeff admitted that he had given her a ride while she was hitchhiking and had given her his business card. He insisted he had no involvement in either Bobby's death or Annette's disappearance. On July 3, 1982, 6 months after Annette Schnee disappeared, her body was discovered just 13 miles from where Bobby Joe Oberholzer had been found. What shocked the police was that Annette was wearing the match to the orange sock found near Bobby's body. To make things even more suspicious, Jeff Oberholzer's business card was found inside her wallet. This made Jeff the prime suspect. Authorities tried to piece together what might have happened on the night of January 6th. Annette was last seen around 4 p.m. in Breckenridge, talking to an unidentified woman. Police believe that around 5 p.m. she left to hitchhike home. The killer likely picked her up and drove her about 20 miles south, down a quiet, dead-end road. There, he assaulted her in his vehicle. While she was getting dressed afterward, Annette forgot to put on one of her orange socks. She tried to run, but was shot in the back while fleeing. Police believed that after killing Annette, the suspect returned to Breckenridge, where he found his second victim, Bobby Joe. He likely drove Bobby about 10 miles south to a scenic spot and tried to assault her. Bobby managed to escape, but during the struggle, her other orange sock fell out of the car. The killer chased her and shot her twice as she turned to run. The fact that Jeff knew both women raised a lot of eyebrows. 2 months after Bobby's death, Jeff took a polygraph test and passed. From the start, he insisted he had an alibi. Jeff claimed he was at home with a friend the night of the murders, but for years, this friend couldn't be located. Finally, in December 1990, the man resurfaced and was interviewed. He confirmed he had been at Jeff's house, but their stories didn't line up perfectly. Jeff always maintained his innocence, stating that Bobby wouldn't have gone with a stranger, especially since she had the option of calling him for a ride. DNA testing in the early 1990s confirmed the blood on Bobby's gloves and tissues wasn't hers. It belonged to a man. The DNA also cleared Jeff. As more evidence emerged, including multiple witnesses supporting his alibi, Jeff was ruled out as a suspect. Over the years, police looked at other possible suspects. One of them was Thomas Edward Luther, a cab driver who had assaulted a hitchhiker in Breckenridge in February 1982. While in jail, he allegedly bragged about being involved in the murders. His girlfriend also mentioned that he didn't come home the night Bobby and Annette were killed. But his DNA didn't match the crime scene evidence. Another suspect was Tracy Petroselli, who had killed his fiancée in 1981 and committed multiple crimes across several states. During this spree, he stayed at the Holiday Inn in Frisco, where Annette worked. However, his DNA also didn't match the evidence. The case took a major turn in 2021. On February 24th, 70-year-old Alan Lee Phillips was arrested and charged with the murders of both Bobby Joe Oberholzer and Annette Schnee, as well as kidnapping and assault with a deadly weapon. Phillips was linked to the crimes through genetic genealogy, which tied his DNA to the evidence left at the scene. He is currently being held without bail, and investigators suspect he may be responsible for other unsolved crimes in Colorado. Tragically, Bobby's brother, Kelly, and her father, Thomas, passed away before learning the identity of the man responsible for taking her life. In 1996, Julie Buskin, or Julie as she was known, lived in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Julie had grown up in Benton, Arkansas, and moved to Oklahoma to attend the University of Oklahoma. She worked at the university's golf course and was close to finishing her degree in dance. Julie dreamed of becoming a ballet teacher and opening her own studio to teach kids. She was talented, popular, and had many friends at school. On December 19, 1996, Julie spent the evening with her friend Ryan James at his grandparents' house. They worked together at the golf course. After having dinner, they watched a movie and made plans to have lunch the next day. Julie stayed until 10 p.m., then went to hang out with other friends. They played Monopoly and exchanged Christmas gifts. Julie said her goodbyes since she was planning to move back home the next day after finishing her semester at college. Her roommate, Megan, was also at the gathering. Julie had promised Megan she'd give her a ride to the airport the next morning at 5 a.m. They decided to stay up all night, so after leaving the friend's house, they went to a restaurant called The Kettle at around 2 a.m. After eating, they stopped at a gas station to fill up and get a cappuccino. They returned to their apartment after 3 a.m. to gather Megan's belongings. Shortly after, they left again, heading to the airport around 4:30 a.m. Julie dropped Megan off at Will Rogers Airport, and Megan watched Julie drive away in her Red Eagle Summit. Around 5:30 a.m. at Julie's apartment complex, Dublin West Apartments, some residents heard a woman scream in terror. One neighbor called 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked. Yeah, we were just sleeping, and my wife heard a really strange, awful scream from the parking lot of our apartment complex, the caller explained. Can you see anything outside? The operator asked. No, I'm kind of afraid to go out there, the caller admitted. Later that day, Ryan James showed up at Julie's apartment for their lunch plans, but she wasn't there and her car was missing. Worried, he reported her missing. Soon after, Julie's parents arrived at her apartment, driving from Arkansas to help her move home, but instead, they were met by police who told them that Julie had disappeared. 12 hours after Julie went missing, her body was discovered on the shore of a lake, 15 miles from her apartment. Her hands were tied behind her back with shoelaces, and she was found in the water from the waist up. Julie had been shot once, execution style, in the back of the head. The wound was a contact shot, and there was evidence that she had also been assaulted. At the lake where Julie Buskin's body was found, investigators discovered some important clues in the sand. There were 2 sets of footprints leading down to the water. One set belonged to Julie, while the other was believed to be from the person who killed her. Only one set of prints returned from the lake. After examining the footprint and consulting with Nike, police determined it matched a men's size 9 Nike Air 2 running shoe. About 20 feet away from Julie's body, investigators found a crumpled pink leotard with the initials JB on the label. It was Julie's leotard, and it contained male DNA, which was preserved for future use when DNA testing would improve. The autopsy confirmed Julie had been shot once in the head with a .22 caliber bullet. The gun used was very specific, but more on that later. Julie had many friends at Oklahoma University, so the investigators set out to interview them in hopes of finding leads. But no one disliked Julie, and she had no bad breakups or conflicts with anyone. Her apartment was in perfect order, with no signs of a struggle. The police found her car abandoned just 1 block from her apartment. Red sand on the floor of the car matched the red sand from the lake where her body was discovered. This puzzled the police. Why would someone kill Julie at the lake, then drive her car back to almost the same spot where she was abducted? Even more frustrating, there were no hairs, fibers, or fingerprints left in the car, and no evidence of a struggle. Julie's cell phone was also missing. Investigators checked her phone records and found that someone had made 2 calls after she had been killed. One was to check the weather forecast, and the other was to a number that was no longer in service. Despite the leads and a $70,000 reward, no major breakthroughs came, and the case went cold for a while. About a month after Julie was murdered, a man called the police with new information. He said that on the night Julie disappeared, he almost collided with a car similar to hers near the lake. The witness followed the car for about 5 miles because he wanted to confront the driver. He noticed that the driver kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror and eventually sped away. The witness got a brief look at the driver's face and helped the police create a composite sketch. The sketch depicted a young man, possibly a college student, Hispanic, with long black hair and a muscular build. The sketch was shown repeatedly on local media, but no one could identify him. The case went cold again for 4.5 years, until the police received a letter from a female inmate at the Oklahoma County Jail. She claimed that an old acquaintance of hers might have been responsible for Julie's death. The man she named was 23-year-old Dennis Sturmer, a construction worker with no criminal record. At the time of the crime, he had lived just 4 blocks away from Julie's apartment and bore a strong resemblance to the composite sketch. Police brought Sturmer in for questioning, but he refused to answer and wouldn't provide a DNA sample voluntarily. The police had to obtain a court order to collect his DNA. Sturmer's DNA profile came back very close to the male DNA found on Julie's leotard. However, very close is not a match, and without a full match, Sturmer was no longer considered a suspect. The case remained unsolved, and the search for Julie's killer continued. After 5 years, the investigation into the tragic murder of 21-year-old Julie Buskin seemed like it was finally on the verge of being solved. Investigators had turned their attention to Dennis Sturmer, whose DNA was almost, but not quite, a match to the sample found at the crime scene. Sturmer's only living male relative was his brother. Surely this had to be the answer. But in a twist, his brother's DNA didn't match either. The case went cold once again, leaving Julie's family heartbroken. Julie's parents were faced with the painful reality that they might never live to see justice for their daughter. But the investigators weren't ready to give up. They tested over 200 men, anyone Julie had ever been in contact with, but no one matched the DNA found on her leotard, and the case seemed like it would never be solved. Then, 6 years after Julie's life was taken, Anthony Castillo Sanchez was arrested for assaulting his girlfriend. Following the arrest, Sanchez was required to provide a DNA sample, as per standard procedure. Investigators soon found some chilling details about his background. He lived just 1 mile away from Julie's apartment at the time of her murder, and one of his ex-girlfriends even had a diary entry from that same month, stating that Anthony had bought a pair of Nike running shoes for himself and his girlfriend, exactly like the ones the suspect had worn. Sanchez wore a size 9, just like the footprints found at the lake where Julie's body was discovered. There was more. One of Sanchez's ex-girlfriends had a phone number that was just 1 digit off from the number dialed on Julie's phone after her murder. It was possible that Sanchez had tried to call his ex from memory, but misdialed. Even more disturbingly, Sanchez and his father had a habit of firing .22 caliber guns inside the house they rented. When investigators recovered a bullet from the house, they found that it matched the gun used to shoot Julie. This particular type of gun, with distinctive grooves, was made by only 6 manufacturers. Finally, in 2004, Anthony Sanchez's DNA was compared to the male DNA found on Julie's leotard. It was an exact match. Sanchez had been only 18 years old when he murdered Julie. One small mistake, dialing the wrong number on her phone, had allowed him to evade capture for years. In 2006, Anthony Castillo Sanchez was convicted of Julie Buskin's murder and sentenced to death. Even as recently as March 2023, Sanchez continued to challenge his conviction. He claimed that it was actually his father, Glenn Sanchez, who had committed the crime. Glenn had taken his own life in April 2022 and allegedly told his girlfriend that he was the one responsible. But investigators had already ruled out Glenn as a suspect. The DNA evidence left no doubt. According to court documents, the chances of the DNA match being a mistake were astronomically low, 1 in 200 quadrillion for Caucasians, 1 in 20 quintillion for African Americans, and 1 in 94 quadrillion for Southwest Hispanics. Anthony Sanchez is scheduled to be executed on September 21, 2023, finally bringing some closure to the brutal crime that devastated Julie Buskin's family and community. Murfreesboro, Tennessee, a place known for the historic Battle of Stones River during the Civil War, is today a rapidly growing town, home to Middle Tennessee State University. But in 1984, the town became infamous for a crime that still haunts the community: the murder of 18-year-old university student Laura Salmon. On May 31, 1984, a farmer in Murfreesboro made a disturbing discovery. While walking through his field, he noticed some clothing lying on the ground. Upon closer inspection, he found the body of a young woman, barely dressed, covered by 2 pairs of jeans and a dark jacket. The sleeve of the jacket was tightly wrapped around her neck. Investigators later identified the victim as Laura Salmon. Laura was a local, born on October 6, 1965, and a student at Middle Tennessee State University. She also worked part-time as a cashier at a Kroger grocery store. She was well-liked by friends and family and had her whole life ahead of her. The autopsy revealed that Laura had died from blunt force trauma. Rocks found near her body were believed to be the murder weapon. She had been struck up to 10 times in the head, resulting in fatal injuries. Additionally, the medical examiner found evidence that Laura had been intimate with someone within 24 to 48 hours before her death, but there were no signs of assault, indicating it was consensual. One of the most crucial pieces of evidence found at the crime scene was a pair of men's jeans on top of Laura's body. Investigators believed these jeans might belong to the perpetrator. DNA was collected from the jeans, but since DNA testing was still in its early stages in 1984, there was little investigators could do with it at the time. The DNA was stored for later analysis when technology would improve. Investigators then tried to piece together a timeline of Laura's final day. She had started her day by working her shift at Kroger. Records showed she left work around 1 p.m. Afterward, she had plans to go to Middle Tennessee State University to check her grades and meet with school staff. She was also planning to go swimming at her grandmother's house, but she never made it to either location. Laura's car was found parked near the Kroger where she worked, miles away from where her body was found. There were no fingerprints in the car that didn't belong to Laura, but a foreign hair was discovered, which was preserved along with the DNA from the jeans. Investigators also found dirt in the car's wheel wells, which the FBI later determined matched the dirt from the road near the crime scene. This indicated that Laura's car had been driven back to the Kroger parking lot after she had been killed. While this evidence suggested that the killer may have known Laura, the lead didn't yield further clues. Witnesses came forward, saying they had seen Laura at a nightclub the night before she died. She had been dancing with an unidentified young man, but investigators were never able to track him down. Laura Salmon's body was found in an area known as Lover's Lane. a secluded spot popular with high school and college students who went there to party and have bonfires. Investigators soon developed a theory. After finishing her shift at Kroger, Laura met a man at a nightclub and they drove to Lover's Lane. Once there, she likely rejected his advances, leading him to violently take her life. With no clear suspect, investigators initially turned to Laura's high school boyfriend, David Kyle Gilly, who was known for his jealous nature. However, Gilly's stepfather provided him with an alibi, claiming he had been home all day when Laura was killed, effectively ruling him out as a suspect. The investigation seemed to stall until a woman in Nashville, Tennessee, contacted police with a lead. She claimed she had been assaulted by a man named John Taylor, and during the attack, he allegedly told her that he would do to her what he had done to Laura. When questioned, Taylor denied any involvement with Laura's death, and there was no solid evidence to tie him to the crime. Taylor, however, was found to have attended the same university as Laura and even frequented the same health club, Olympus Athletic Club and Spa. He had attended fraternity functions Laura had also been part of. Additionally, Taylor was known to have a violent history with women and had been near the university on the day Laura was murdered. Investigators believed they had found their man. The FBI compared a hair found in Laura's car to Taylor's hair, and they found it to be consistent. But despite this, the case wasn't closed. At that time, mitochondrial DNA testing was still in its early stages, and the hair could have matched about 20% of the population. Adding to the doubt was the fact that the men's jeans found at the crime scene, with a 36-inch inseam and 30-inch waist, wouldn't have fit Taylor, who was a much smaller man. Taylor, like Gilly, was ruled out. For years, investigators followed over 100 leads, but none of them panned out. Laura's mother, Laureen Mackey, made a promise to her daughter at her grave that she would find justice, though at the time, she wasn't sure how to keep that promise. Finally, in a surprising twist, it was Laura's friend from college, Dan Goodwin, who became the key to solving the case. Dan had taken Laura to a movie just days before her death, and at her funeral, he promised Laureen that he would help bring her daughter's killer to justice. After graduation, Dan became a police reporter for the Daily News Journal in Murfreesboro. He wrote about unsolved cases, including Laura's, and realized he was more interested in investigating crimes than reporting on them. He left journalism to become a police officer, and his first cold case assignment was Laura's murder. Dan immediately sent all the evidence from Laura's case to the forensic lab for retesting, hoping the advancements in DNA technology could finally crack the case. While awaiting results, he pursued new leads, one of which came from an unexpected source, a high school student. In 2000, a student at Oakland High School casually mentioned that his father had killed a girl in 1984 and dumped her body. This startling confession would soon lead to a major breakthrough in the case. The investigation into Laura Salmon's murder took a significant turn when a high school student claimed that his father, David Patterson, had killed a girl in 1984. Patterson had a police record for aggravated assault, but by the time investigators wanted to question him, he had already passed away after being fatally shot. Despite this, the investigation continued. DNA from Patterson's children was tested, but the results did not match the DNA found at the crime scene, ruling him out as a suspect. Determined not to give up, investigator Dan Goodwin, a close friend of Laura's who had promised her mother he would find the killer, revisited earlier suspects, including John Taylor. However, Taylor's DNA didn't match either. Dan even provided his own DNA sample, which also cleared him. Dan then shifted his focus back to someone who had been quickly ruled out during the initial investigation, Laura's high school boyfriend, David Gilly. Gilly, a year younger than Laura, had been dismissed as a suspect because his stepfather provided an alibi, claiming David had been home all day. But when Dan dug deeper, he found a witness who contradicted that alibi. The witness had seen Gilly driving Laura's car the day her body was found, and the witness identified him in a photo lineup. Gilly had a blank expression on his face, and the witness clearly remembered Laura's car. What Dan uncovered next shocked him. Gilly had a history of violence toward Laura. He would often physically abuse her, grabbing her head and slamming it into lockers or cars, even knocking out 2 of her front teeth. Despite this, Jilly had somehow been overlooked as a prime suspect during the original investigation. Jilly's height, 6'2", matched the size of the men's jeans found at the crime scene. The inseam and waist measurements were consistent with his build. To further solidify the case, Dan brought in Jerry Finley, a crime scene reconstruction expert, who found small drops of blood on the jeans. The blood was identified as medium-velocity spatter, indicating it had been caused by blunt force trauma, most likely when the perpetrator was kneeling and striking Laura with a rock. DNA testing confirmed that the blood on the jeans belonged to Laura, and further testing showed that the jeans had also likely belonged to Jilly. When Dan tracked Gilly down in Florida, he was working for the Manatee County Public Works Department and had a record of arrests for battery, burglary, and resisting arrest. Jilly denied any involvement in Laura's death, but strangely admitted that the jeans could be his. After being told the owner of the jeans was likely the killer, Jilly quickly asked for a lawyer. Investigators collected a saliva sample from Jilly, and on May 31, 2000, 16 years after Laura's murder, DNA testing proved Jilly's DNA matched that found at the crime scene. He was arrested and charged with Laura's murder. The motive was believed to be jealousy. Jilly couldn't handle the fact that Laura had moved on, made new friends at college, and distanced herself from him. He was often seen stalking her, and Laura's mother had even urged her to get a restraining order, though Laura was too afraid. Investigators believe Jilly lured Laura to the isolated lover's lane, where he killed her by repeatedly hitting her with rocks. After noticing blood on his jeans, Jilly left them at the scene and drove Laura's car back to her workplace, where it was later found. In September 2006, Jilly went to trial. His defense tried to argue that another man's DNA at the scene suggested someone else was involved, but the jury wasn't convinced. Jilly was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to life in prison. Dan Goodwin, the investigator and Laura's friend, kept his promise to her mother, and after years of searching, Laura finally received justice. Next, we turn to the tragic case of Sylvia May Quayle. On August 4, 1981, William Quayle made the short walk from his house in Cherry Hills Village near Denver, Colorado, to visit his daughter Sylvia. She lived just 150 feet away. What he found that morning was something no parent should ever have to experience. Sylvia May Quayle, 34 years old, was known for her warmth, ambition, and creativity. She worked as a secretary at an architectural firm, but her true passion was in the arts. Sylvia had started her own business making wedding cakes and was an avid potter. Her work still decorates her sister's home more than 3 decades later. Sylvia had many friends, and she was especially close to her parents, having coffee with them every morning, except that morning. Just before 8 a.m. on August 4, 1981, police arrived at Sylvia's house after her father found her lifeless body and called 911. Sylvia had spoken to her sister the night before, around 11 p.m., which helped investigators narrow down the time of her death to between that call and when her father discovered her body 9 hours later. William Quayle told officers that when he arrived at his daughter's home, he found her lying naked on the living room floor. Sylvia had been shot, stabbed multiple times, strangled, and sexually assaulted. An autopsy confirmed that she died from the blood loss caused by her injuries. 2 important clues were found at the crime scene. The phone lines in the living room and outside the house had been cut, and the screen from a bathroom window had been removed and thrown into some tall weeds. Investigators gathered over 140 pieces of evidence, and as technology advanced, they continued to analyze the items. In 1983, 2 years after her death, forensic experts using new technology discovered DNA on the rug where Sylvia's body was found, but it didn't belong to her. That same year, notorious serial killer Otis Elwood Toole confessed to Sylvia's murder. However, Toole was known for making false confessions, often alongside his partner in crime, Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas, who died in prison in 2001, had claimed responsibility for hundreds of murders, but authorities were only able to verify a few. In 1993, Charges against Toole were dropped after DNA testing showed he wasn't responsible for Sylvia's death. In 1995, a section of the rug from Sylvia's house was submitted for further DNA testing. 5 years later, authorities were able to extract an unknown male DNA profile, but they didn't have a match, and the case went cold again. Then, in January 2020, detectives decided to use genetic genealogy, a cutting-edge technique, to revisit Sylvia's case. 4 months later, they had a name: David Dwayne Anderson. At the time of Sylvia's murder, Anderson, then 22 years old, lived just a few miles away from her. Investigators began tracking Anderson, who had since moved to Cozad, Nebraska. Detective Robert Fuller traveled there to secretly collect a DNA sample from Anderson. Fuller recovered 2 trash bags that Anderson had thrown into a dumpster. Among the 15 items collected was a vanilla Coke can. On January 29, 2021, genetic material from the Coke can matched the DNA found at Sylvia's crime scene. Investigators then discovered that Anderson had committed at least 8 burglaries between 1981 and 1986. In one case, he had gained entry by removing and discarding a window screen, just like at Sylvia's home. David Dwayne Anderson, now 62 years old, was arrested on February 10, 2021. Unfortunately, Sylvia's parents, William and Mary Quayle, had passed away before they could see justice. William died in 1999, and Mary followed 10 years later, never knowing that their daughter's killer had finally been identified and arrested. The final case is the tragic story of Bonnie Baker. On the night of June 30, 1998, Bonnie Baker was celebrating a promotion at work with her friends. Her boyfriend, Crespin Nenny Perez, joined the party, and shortly after, tensions rose. The couple left together, and that was the last time anyone saw Bonnie alive. Bonnie, a 47-year-old woman from Denver, Colorado, lived with Nene Perez, whom she had met while working at the Fort, a restaurant in Morrison. Bonnie was known for her strong work ethic, rarely missing a day and always showing up on time. Her dedication earned her a recent promotion. Nene Perez, on the other hand, had been fired a month earlier for missing too many shifts. The night of the party, Bonnie was enjoying herself with friends in Golden, Colorado, when Nene Perez showed up and became visibly upset. Witnesses later described him as acting erratically, with red, glazed eyes, possibly under the influence of drugs. His jealousy was evident, especially after seeing Bonnie dance with her friends. Several people at the party noted how angry and agitated he seemed, staring down others at the gathering. Sensing trouble, Bonnie told a friend, "It would be better if I just go now, or it will be worse." Shortly after, Bonnie and Nene Perez left the party together. At around 8 p.m., police received a call from an unidentified woman claiming a man had killed a woman in an apartment on West Louisiana Avenue. She warned that the man was preparing to drive to Mexico in a red car with the woman's body in the trunk, planning to dispose of it along the way. The call was traced to a payphone, and police rushed to the address. When they arrived, there was no sign of a struggle or any people at the apartment. The following day, Nenny Perez's car was involved in a crash near Globe, Arizona, but he fled the scene on foot. The car was impounded, and investigators collected blood from the trunk as evidence. The case went cold for nearly a year. On July 31, 1999, 2 boys riding horses on Navajo tribal lands in New Mexico stumbled across a human skull. Investigators later found additional skeletal remains, but the cause of death was unclear, and there was no immediate connection to Bonnie's case. In 2012, cold case detective Kenneth Klaus took over Bonnie's case. He reached out to the FBI in New Mexico, and DNA samples from the remains found on the Navajo grounds were sent to Denver for forensic testing. They matched DNA taken from Bonnie Baker. On April 4, 2013, the anonymous woman who made the 911 call came forward. She revealed she had cleaned Bonnie and Nenny Perez's apartment the night of the disappearance, before the police arrived. According to her, the place was in disarray, with broken plates, glasses, and an overturned kitchen table. She also described the red car in detail, identifying it as a Geo Prism along with its license plate number. The woman also claimed that Nene Perez had confided in her, saying, "I know you don't like Bonnie. Something bad happened to us. You will never have to see her again, because I'm going to make her disappear. Her relationship to the couple remains unclear, but her testimony, along with a witness identifying Neen Perez in a photo lineup, helped investigators gather enough evidence to arrest him. A warrant was issued for Neen Perez, but by then he was living in Mexico. After years of delays, he was finally extradited back to Colorado. Prosecutors believe Bonnie's body was likely left in a shallow grave soon after her disappearance. On January 27, 2021, a preliminary hearing was held in Denver court, where Neen Perez faced charges of kidnapping and killing Bonnie Baker. If you found this case interesting, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell button to stay updated on more mysterious stories waiting to be uncovered. Thanks for watching.